it still morning? Good morning. On behalf of Kurt and the leadership team, I'm really excited to welcome you and thank you for staying for our meeting this morning. So we'd like to open in prayer. Please join me in praying. Most loving and gracious Father, we ask for your presence in our meeting today. Grant that we may act wisely in service to you as we look to and plan for the future location of this church. Open our minds to respond to your calling, for it is you who led us to this church, you who guide us in our individual and collective missions, and you, Father, who will bring it all to fulfillment. Help us to know and to believe in the gifts that you have given us. Father, grant us wisdom to discern your will, for it is in faith and hope we trust in your presence and guidance today. Amen.
And just in case you didn't know, that was Glennis, and Glennis is one of the co-chairs of our leadership team with Carlos Womack. Okay, so I get the job here at the beginning anyway of sort of framing this meeting for us a little bit. So I love knowing the purpose of something, like why are we doing what we're doing? So on your handout, which we'll email out later on too so you have it, that purpose is right there for you. Isn't that great? One of them, sort of a threefold purpose. First one, and maybe most obvious, is authenticity. That's one of our core values, and so we're seeking to be transparent. We want to be open and honest about what's happening, where we are, our ideas about where we're going. And so this is sort of where we currently stand with worship and office space, and we're going to talk about finances and other things that are part of that conversation, but that's first and foremost. It's just to clue you in as to what's happening. Second thing is that we're going to get your feedback, and that'll happen. There's a QR code at the bottom and a link for a survey. We'll email it out for those who aren't here or for you if you lose this paper, but we want to hear from our people, and so we'll send the survey out, and we want you to be able to offer feedback. You can also just come and have a conversation. I'd love to have coffee or a meal or something else with you to talk about any of these things and collect your feedback in that way as well. And then last and most important is spiritual discernment. Right? We can't predict the future. I've yet to figure out how to do that. As soon as I can, I will let you know. So what we're doing is doing our best to discern together where the Spirit is leading us and how we want to move forward into the future. A couple things on the handout. You can see where we're going, the agenda. First thing, for these current considerations, just so you're aware, part of it is we signed a 1-year lease with Reality to be in this space, and that lease expires August 1st. We signed the lease. Reality is fine if we go month to month, but somebody could call up and say, hey, we want to rent the Reality Center for the whole weekend 3 months from now, and it would be open. So we signed the year lease to make sure that we have the space and no one else can use it on a Sunday morning. Reality is open to continuing this lease. They're fine if we want to do another 1-year lease or if we wanted to seek a multi-year lease because we wanted to be in this space for a set amount of time as we plan for the future. Another consideration, which is about as murky as you can get, but for those of you who didn't know, and Amy Crump's going to talk about this a bit more, we used to meet at Creekside Elementary School. Durham Public Schools shut down indoor rentals at the beginning of the pandemic, and they hadn't opened them back up. Well, we got word, like just at the end of last week, that DPS is sort of reopening indoor rentals, but they've gone through 2 different facility rentals folks since the person who was with us for like a decade retired. So there's not much institutional memory that, oh, the Gathering Church was in Creekside Elementary School for a decade and had built great partnerships and all those other things. So Emily is doing her best. Y'all, she's calling, she's emailing. We're trying to figure out, is it going to be open to rent in the same way that we rented it in the past? Now, us asking that, though, we have to be clear about this. That does not mean that we're saying, oh, if it is available, well, then we're just going to go back and do that. Because there are plenty of things about Creekside Elementary School, as those of you who've been there before know, were not ideal, like the acoustics. So Bill Funkhauser can hear me right now. At Creekside Elementary School, maybe he couldn't hear me there. Or where Don Taylor's sitting in the back. It's going to be a little bit dicey. It just depended, right? There were also benefits to that space. So we're just letting you know, though, that it might be an option. And I hate lack of clarity, but that's as clear as I can give you right now as it relates to Creekside. And people ask often, and it's okay to ask, and we'll do our best to answer it as clearly as we can at any given moment. Last thing, we're having this meeting, and you'll hear more about this from Rebecca a little bit later, because of the opportunity that was presented to us to purchase property with a church building on it. And so at the end of the day, what you need to know is we considered, should we do this, and could we do this financially? The answer to could we was no, and so that's why we're talking about some of the financials that are on the handout so that you have an idea of where we are and those sorts of things. Also, we want feedback because a lot has changed in the last several years, not only in the life of the world with the pandemic, but in the life of our congregation, right? There are lots of familiar faces in here. There are a lot of new faces that only know worship and the Gathering Church in this building right here. They have no idea what Creekside or United Church, which happened way back at the beginning, was like. And so part of this is, where are we? Do we still want to be in this place? Do we want to be in a different place? We're discerning these things together so that we can answer, where is the Spirit leading us in the midst of all this change? Are some of our desires still our desires? Last thing I'll say is, there is no perfect space unless one of you has $2 to $5 million that you'd like to give me at any point, not me, the church. Don't get me wrong, I would take that as well. But as we're currently talking about these things, and even then, that space wouldn't be perfect for everybody because maybe it wouldn't be in the location that you particularly wanted. What we're doing, though, is not trying to be perfect for everybody. We're trying to figure out what's the best, most faithful step for the Gathering Church. Okay, that said, Amy Crump is going to come and just give a brief sort of background to the history question so that whether you've been here for a long time or are just recent, you know some of the places that we've been and some of the opportunities for space that have come our way in the past. And Amy, by the way, served on leadership team, but she also was on our space discovery team, which is the best name for a church committee team in the history of names for these things.
And I've been here a long time too, so I'm just going to give y'all a history as to what I know. I'm pretty sure it's not a comprehensive history. Like Kurt said, I was on leadership team starting around 2016 and then headed up the space discovery team from there. And so I'll give you what I know, and I think it's pretty thorough. So we started off way back in the day at United Church of Chapel Hill, and we worshiped at 5 p.m. in a small meeting room, and then there was a larger room for potluck after. And then, of course, we met at Creekside for a large number of years, and that's what we're all most familiar with that have been here for pre-pandemic. We had a 10:30 a.m. begin time. We started in the cafeteria with a few classrooms, and then we moved to the gymnasium, and we used the cafeteria for potlucks, and we had a lot of classroom space, While we were at Creekside, we had a few opportunities that arose. Mount Moriah Baptist Church at one point asked if we might be interested in a congregational merger. We worshiped with them for a Sunday, but we figured it wasn't a good fit. And then we were approached about purchasing a building which has become Oak Church, And we realized at the time that it might not have been the best fit for the Gathering Church, but it became a great launch for our sister church, Oak Church. Then Journey Church was another church that asked if maybe we were interested in a congregational merger, and we worshiped with them for a Sunday and also realized that it wasn't a good fit. While I was on leadership team, we looked at a property on Club Boulevard. It was an opportunity to lease, but the location was outside of our desired circle and our radius, and the cost was a negative as well. We heard that Resurrection UMC at one point was thinking about selling their space, and so we asked them if they might be interested in considering us. We visited the church, toured the building, not actual on a Sunday worship, but we toured the building. We talked with those who were going to be responsible for selling the building, and ultimately the UMC larger body decided to keep it in the family, and it's now become New Creation UMC. And so now here we are at Reality Ministries, which is our current location, and we recently considered the Love Chapel Hill building and found that it wasn't financial viable. I also just want to say that in talking about building space, I find myself super grateful for the buildings that God has given us and the opportunity that these buildings have given us to give back to the community because of their cost effectiveness. So I'm excited to hear what steps we have next, and yeah, I'll pass it off to whoever's up next.
Thanks, Amy. Rebecca Dickinson is going to come now, and she's going to share about this latest opportunity that came our way. And another just reminder in the midst of all this is that, much like Zacchaeus, right, a building, any of them, rental, lease, ownership, is not the end goal. Right? Reminder, the end goal is like us living into the kingdom of God here on earth and participating in that. So Rebecca's going to share about this latest opportunity that came our way.
Great, thank you. My name is Rebecca Dickinson. I'm new to the leadership team, so I just joined the leadership team this year. And when I joined the leadership team, one of the first meetings was a question that opened that meeting that said, if you could wave your wand for the Gathering Church, what would you do? What would you do with that if you could have one wish for the Gathering Church? And what's interesting is space came up in part of that conversation, having a space of our own. And it was not a few weeks after joining the leadership team and having some of that conversation that through a connection, through work and community, we learned that the Foundry, which was owned by Love Chapel Hill, was up for sale before it hit the market. So our Gathering Church leadership team had the opportunity to go and quickly visit the location, look at it, have a price, and consider it before it went to commercial market. And we knew the price, and there's some really good details of a summary on your program for you. But we knew it was $1.625 million is what they were asking for. We were quickly able to get a dozen people to the property and just to take a look and consider it as something we might want to own, because just as Amy explained, we knew in the history of the church that there was a desire to consider owning a space. And it seemed like a good fit. It was on the Durham side of 40. I encourage you to Google it or look at it on a map, but it met that radius that Amy just quickly mentioned of being, close to that Durham and Chapel Hill split, and that was a definition at the time of what we were looking for. 150 people could worship in it easily. It had some classroom space. It had some acreage. It seemed like a good fit. So as Kurt said, the leadership team thought, should we do this? And could we do this? And in trying to figure out those two paths at the same time, realizing that financially the church was not in a position to do it, even if we wanted to, was a realization that the Gathering Church leadership team didn't have previously. So in looking and talking to banks and knowing what expectations are, lending on a physical side to churches is something that banks are really careful about, because to foreclose on a church is a really bad thing to do. So what they ask for is, 20 to 25% in down payment on 1.625 million, which is a smaller price for a commercial building. And then they're going to also look to have about a year's worth of mortgage payments in the bank as cushion. So that added up to being a seed money or a building fund that was separate of the reserves that the church just didn't have at the moment, and brings us back to consider what we need to be doing in the next 2 to 3 years. Like, what does it look like for space and rental and where we're at now, and then what do we want to be doing as a church to plan ahead in the next 2 to 3 years for thinking about if we want to continue to purchase a building. I'm open to any questions. My relationship with Justin Simmons at Love Chapel Hill, we were co-workers for 4 years at the chamber and worked very closely together. So I got chosen to share this piece of the meeting because I know him well and know that property well. So if you have any questions about that in particular, I'm happy to help. Is there anything else that you want from me? Great. Thank you.
And you'll see that at the end of the meeting, we're going to, well, you don't see that. We're doing Q&A at the end. And so you can ask a question about any of the stuff, right? History, this particular opportunity, what Miguel Figueroa is about to come and share. Miguel, you can go ahead and come, Miguel. Miguel's the chair of our finance team. And so Miguel's going to share about the information that you have in the handout, which informed, right, the decision and the recognition, oh yeah, we're not able to pursue this even if we wanted to. And so we're giving you all this information, and then we're going to open it up and say, questions, feel free to ask them. So, Miguel.
As you can see, I'm taller than Zacchaeus. I don't need to climb a tree to see you. I am not a rich man, I'm not a tax collector, and I recently was invited to join the financial team, and following Bobby's steps is very difficult, but we can do it together. And currently we have 3 members in the financial team, Nick Hahn and Jane Summers Kelly, and myself. And Bobby has offered to give us the support whenever we request it. Now, these numbers are very self-understanding. I don't have to explain to you on a breakdown chart or anything like that. So basically, you can read them, you can ask questions, and we try to answer them. And that's, otherwise, I'll be having you here for a couple of hours showing you little details, and everybody be going to sleep, and I'll be continue to explain on big charts and everywhere, the cash flow, this and that, return on investments, etc. So any questions, we'll be happy to answer now or as we mingle. Sir?
So what we'll do too is we're going to repeat these questions as they're asked, because folks who are streaming can't hear, first of all, but then we're going to record too, and it's just good in case you didn't hear. So Ron asked if the figure for reality rent is a monthly fee or a yearly fee. That is the yearly fee for renting this and other parts of the space. Good question, Ron. Say it again. Yes. Peyton. That's right. So Peyton asked about the number right below that, right below the Reality Center's rent, and if that's just for comparison purposes. Yes, that is for comparison purposes, and that's what it cost us when we signed our new version of the contract back in 2020, which, as you know, then shifted dramatically, but that's what it was costing us per year at the time. All right, let's go with Brandon, and then we'll do Shauna. Curious what it's for. Okay. So Brandon asked just about the reserves, is that right? Okay. About the reserves balance, what it's for, and if that's at the level that we want it to be at. Miguel, do you want to answer, or do you want me? I'm happy to try.
Well, you can try, and if you fail, I'll correct it.
Oh, I love this. Miguel is so smart. Miguel's like, yeah, you try, and if you fail, I'll look good. Miguel is no dummy. So the reserves, generally speaking, how it works for us, our operations balance is the number that basically cash flows the church expenses throughout the year. So we are given a large portion of our yearly giving at the end of each calendar year, November and December. For whatever reason, it could be holiday giving. It's that folks like to give at the end of the year when they look back over their year's income. We get a bigger push at the end. And so that operations balance refills, and then that's what we pull from in addition to giving when we're paying bills, right, and salaries and all that stuff. The reserves balance, what we'd like to have is, or what's standard nonprofit practice, and Rebecca can answer more about that, is to have a year's worth of your expenses in reserves, so that if everyone connected to the Gathering Church suddenly didn't give for an entire year, we could still function for a year at that level. That's sort of an extreme situation, and let's hope that doesn't happen, but if it did, that's the goal. So it's close to where we want it to be if it's just for that. In the past, the thought was that the reserve balance could be used for a building fund and to put a down payment or things like that. In our conversations with the banks, they wanted to see operations balance where it is, reserves where it is, but then the other money, the down payment and the 12 months mortgage, separate from that. So you're talking, when you look at those lines up above it for the 325 and the 406, 325 to 406, plus the 83, that's in addition to the reserves that we already have, which was relatively new information. Shauna, I think, had the question. Right, so Shauna's, she said not a question, but an addition, more information. The Creekside number, just to give it context, that number is a reduced rate because we developed good relationships with the various principals over the years at Creekside, and each principal of a public school can waive part of or all of the rental fee. Not everything, we still pay other stuff, obviously. And so that is not a guarantee. We currently have a good relationship with the current principal, but you never know. And just to give you reference for if we were looking at another elementary school or high school or another public school building, that may not be an option. So that's just extra information. She said could be as much as double as what that number is, which I didn't realize, but that's a lot. Matt.
So the fiscal year projected giving budget expenses, those are full 12-month projections. The balances, are those balances as of now, or were those like...
As of April 30th.
Yeah, so great question. So Matt's asking about two things. The balances that you see for the operations balance and the reserves balance. If that's current, sort of where we are now, or is that at the end of the year? You said April 30th? Yep. So that's as of the end of April, when the last monthly reconciliation was done, for the operations balance and the reserves balance. And did you ask a question, Matt, about?
So the budget expenses for the year, I'm guessing that was like the annual projection.
So he's asking about the projected giving and the budgeted expenses on those two line items. At the beginning of the year, the Gathering Church sets out a budget and says, here's the money we're going to spend, and it's big and a plan, and it never matches up exactly. That's sort of how budgets work. In the history of the Gathering Church so far, we've spent less than we've said we were going to spend historically. And then the projected giving is just that. It is a projection. It's relatively accurate most of the time. Pandemic made that a little bit weirder, and you got those emails when we were moving through some of that, but it's sort of our best guess, and by our, I don't have anything to do with that, but people who know these things, their best guess for that. You want to say something?
I'm sorry. Yeah, the current reserves balance of $303,000 includes $119,000 assigned to building by the leadership team. And it also includes about $53,000 for a new hire for a position that we need to fill soon, right? As soon as possible.
Yeah, so Miguel's just given clarity on some of those, the reserves balance there. That about $10,000 of that is donor restricted to go towards building fund. There's a larger portion that the leadership team said, hey, we should set this aside and use for a building, whatever that looks like. That can be adjusted by the leadership team. The donor restricted one, though, has to go towards that unless we go back to the donor and say, let's talk about this gift. And then, yeah, that's enough. I missed somebody. Helen. Can Miguel answer your question since, you know, it feels like he should have to be the one to answer it as your spouse? Yeah, so Helen's just reminding us that when you meet at a public school system building, if it snows on Friday and is 75 degrees on Sunday, it doesn't matter that it's 75 degrees on Sunday. You're not allowed to meet on Sunday because they cancel all weekend activities if school is canceled on a Friday. So in 2019, we missed 5 Sundays because of school cancellation. And we tried to scramble, and we would go to Holy Family, and those of you who are around know that. But basically that we have less control over that sort of space, and she brought up that here we make that decision. Thank you, Helen. Carl. So Carl said, if he understands correctly, that we could lock in the Reality Center space rental for around $20,000 for another year. Yes, assuming, I mean, the rates may go up a little bit. I guess the rates could potentially go down. I doubt it. But yes, that's sort of what we pay this year. We could see an increase, just a yearly thing. We only walk away from the $20,000 commitment into something that marvelously happened. Yeah. Carl is saying if we sign a year lease with Reality and the most amazing opportunity comes our way, and he said it with that grin, and we want to be able to pursue it, by only signing a year lease, we're only walking away from what's left on the year lease. Thankfully, and this is not in writing or anything like that, but we're really good partners with Reality. That's not like a toot, but yeah, we are great partners with Reality, and they're great partners with us. They're grateful that we treat this space as sacred and that we take good care of it. And so in the past, they've said, listen, we understand if something amazing happens, or like a new opportunity, or back when we first were discussing this, the school opens back up and you want to go back to the school. Let's talk about what that would look like. And so again, they didn't guarantee that they would let us out of the release. I'm not saying that, but they're also not saying you're going to pay the remainder of that lease no matter what. Amy.
I'm super curious about the out. I know that youth group is starting to meet here at 5 p.m. in the evening, which is great. That's one thing that we miss, and we're excited that the building's only open on Sunday morning for us. How open is reality to us meeting outside of a Sunday morning, utilizing the building? I know they use it a lot, by the way, but in times that they're not using it, how open are they to us possibly using it?
Right, so in case you didn't hear, Amy asked about the availability of the Reality Center space outside of Sunday mornings. When we were at Creekside, we had the space from whatever time in the morning until the time potluck was over, basically, and that was it. You couldn't use it any other times. With Reality, they, Elizabeth and we just approached them about, hey, could we do youth here so that it's a central location, it's the same location each Sunday so that parents aren't trying to figure out where do we go. And we just gave them dates in May, and they're like, yeah, great, you can use that as part of, we're not going to charge you extra for that. They are also okay if we occasionally want to use it on a Friday night or a Saturday night or Saturday day, as long as they don't have prior programming or someone else hasn't rented the space. They do weddings in here, any number of things. And so they're open to that. And depending on how many of those we did, it may be that they would charge us or not. They're fairly flexible. They are in the space Monday to Friday during the day, during the academic year, pretty much, 8 to 5 or later sometimes. Brandon. Oh, no, Peyton was probably up before Brandon. Brandon's already asked one. He doesn't get enough. You're up. And your spouse asked one, and that's totally different. You're your own person, Peyton. Yeah, great question, Peyton. So Peyton was saying that since he's lived in the household that has looked at space exploration really closely over all these years with Amy, and knowing that at one time 10,000 square feet was sort of the ideal number of square footage that we wanted for a building, and knowing how expensive commercial real estate is here in the Triangle, can we sort of compare this recent opportunity to what we know about previous looking at that? And did the recent opportunity meet some of those? Was it close to this standard of what we wanted? Was it a long way off? Rebecca, do you remember the square footage? 4,500? Okay, 4,500 square feet. It was a small building. One of the great things, I'd encourage you to pick Sean Stonecipher's brain if you'd like. Sean's in the back. Sean played accordion today. Sean actually is connected with the congregation that met in that space. It's one perspective, not the only one. I'm not putting all that on Sean, but he could give you his own personal experience. If you ask members of the leadership team who went to visit the space, you would get different thoughts around that space, right? Some would say like, oh, this part was great. That part was not great. That price tag, we could have gone in and used the space. We would have had to been real creative around office space because it's not very big, so there wasn't much room. Classrooms would have had to double as like an office and meeting space during the week, and then a classroom space for kids on a Sunday. There were plans that were drawn up in the past by a previous church to add on to the building. That can only be done a little bit, and it was pricey, as building is right now, because that space is in the rural buffer zone, which means that like you can't just go in and clear cut trees and build some glorious spectacle for Jesus there. Not that we would do that, but you get the idea. You'd be limited in the expansion. So it would have looked like multiple services or getting creative with the space that was currently there. And our other leadership team members are here, and so they can speak to and say whatever they'd like about that in particular, that opportunity and being related to Ideal.
How many people could it comfortably hold?
For worship, like in the sanctuary. So they told us 150 people comfortably. Sean thinks it's less, I'll just point out. It depends on the size of the chair. If we get lots of the little blue ones from Reality, the little creaky ones, we can jam some people in there. It's Yep. So Rebecca's point is that they had chairs already in there, 130 chairs that are maybe a little bit bigger than our newer nice chairs. Thanks to everybody who provided those. And they were all set up, so 130 is in there. If every one of those was filled with a person, it would not feel comfortable, is Rebecca's point, if all 130 were filled. And there also wouldn't be room for anyone else to then come in. And so if you're at 100 in that space, that feels comfortable, but then not past that. Yep, parking was, anybody remember how many spots were there? Yeah. I think it was around 40. Is that too many? I can't remember. We could look. It was a small parking lot. There was, it was sort of you could park in a grass area, that kind of thing. You can check it out too. Gravel and grass parking lot. Bill, your hand was up, and then Kelly. So Bill said, in case you couldn't hear, Bill said, has the leadership team considered alternate worship times or dates for worship to meet in a church space rather than sort of continually frustrating ourselves with space that we're trying to secure in a more permanent way? So we skipped ahead from the feedback section and jumped into these Q&A, which is great. But Glennis is going to talk about the survey that's linked there and that you can also use the QR code and that we're going to email out. And one of the questions is about that. Would you be willing to meet at a different, Bill mentioned Saturday night, for instance. Would you be willing to meet at an alternate time than Sunday morning? The LT has not explicitly considered that question, although it's part of the survey to do that. That was considered in the past of the Gathering Church, but decided against. Yes, Kelly. Yeah, so that's a great question. Kelly asked about average attendance pre-pandemic and attendance going forward and what that might look like in a new space based on the needs for that space. Pre-pandemic, it depended, but let's say on the whole, we were in the 140 to 160 range. About 150 was safe, sometimes significantly higher, sometimes less. We're a pretty academic calendar church, so summer it dips, graduation Sundays it dips, right? These sorts of things you notice. Moving forward is a great question because I get emails and people say, oh, well, if you were back towards the border of Durham and Chapel Hill, well, then we would be more likely to come. I don't know if that's true, right? I mean, and I don't get a bunch of those. I shouldn't say, it's not like there are 70 people out there like, well, if you'll just move back down here, we'll come. So it's really tricky to gauge what that would be. I would think that, like right now, we would want to be in a space that has at least space for that 130 to 150 range, so that there are open seats for folks who come and want to join in. And on larger Sundays, Easter, Palm Sunday, Christmas Eve, those sorts of things, we can accommodate that. But that's a real tricky thing to predict, sorry. Yep. So Ray's saying statistically, it's great to have about 80% capacity in a church space with 20% not filled, so that when new folks come, they think, oh, there is a place for me here. There's room for me in this place, both literally and within this congregation in this church. Bill. I am sure that there are statistics about that, Bill. Bill asked about statistics around, in particular, he said mainline churches, but we could broaden that out to be churches that are closing down and that their properties might be available for use. He mentioned Oak Church, which was historically the Lakewood Baptist Church. So Baptist churches are actually your best bet when it comes to these sorts of buildings becoming available because the independent local congregation owns the building. What happened, for instance, with the Methodist church in our history is that congregation can die out and a new Methodist thing can come into place. And it could be a merger from multiple Methodist places, but the denomination still owns the building. And that's true for Catholic, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Methodist, and a host of others that I'm forgetting. So an educated guess by good people is 20% maybe of closures in the next 2 to 2.5 years. But that doesn't tell us anything about where that property's going or, if it's available for others, that kind of thing. But church partnership is a glorious thing that I'm a proponent of in lots of ways. Sure. Helen's mentioning that sometimes churches close because they outgrow the space, and so they look for a bigger space, and then their current space is available. I want to pause real quick on questions because I want Glennis to share a little bit about this feedback so that if folks do have to leave, I want to make sure that they hear from Glennis as it relates to this particular piece of it.
So church family, we need your help. As Miguel said, we can do this together. So to that end, we created a survey. We have a few hard copies with us today, but the link will be emailed out, and you also have it at the bottom of our information sheet that will also be emailed. So we're trying to make sure that we get as much information from you as we possibly can. We value your feedback. So on this brief survey, we've asked for specific information like how far you drive, how far would you be willing to drive, but we also want to know what you're feeling. We want to know your opinions about things. We want to know what matters to you. So hopefully in our questioning, we've covered opportunity to get a really good feel for what your vision is as we strive to live out the mission of our church. We've answered a lot of questions, but we've also shared a lot of information today that you may or may not have been aware of. So in preparation for you going back now and completing the survey, we want to make sure that we answer any other questions that you have today, and also that you reach out to us. The information, the contact information for Carlos and me, you'll find at the bottom of the information sheet from today. So please feel free to reach out as questions arise, as you're prayerfully considering next steps for us as a church family. Yes, LeClaire. Yeah.
Okay, so, did you what? Sorry. Did I understand that right? Mostly. Miguel mentioned that in the reserves, there is 50 some odd thousand, I think it's $53,000, that is PPP money. If you remember when the federal government gave out those loans to help pay for staffing, rent, utilities, that sort of thing in the midst of the pandemic. As we conveyed to you back then, we applied for and then were forgiven, and so you get to keep that money as a gift, right? You are meant to use it and to pay for staffing and all those things that are listed. So the leadership team last year set that money and said, let's use that money and take what's already budgeted for these positions that we were looking at hiring at the time. It was just going to be, it was going to be youth and communications because Jessica, our kids director, was still here. Then we opened it up for looking at all three of those positions and how we might best fill them. But so that money was devoted to this new hire, this new position. And that LT said, let's take the budgeted money that was already in the line item of the budget and then take half of the PPP money for 12 months and then the second half of the PPP money for the following 12 months. So to spread that money out to help pay for this new staff position, to view it as an investment into staff and ministry efforts. So to your point, would the budgeted expenses for next year be $50,000 more? No, it would not be $50,000 more. That does not include a full year's worth of the salary, though. But that number, that $392, yes, part of it is increased because of the new hire. Part of it is increased because of a full year of worshiping in person and paying rent, which we haven't done since 2019. Part of it is due to a full year of musicians and programming for youth stuff and kids stuff and those sorts of things. So yes, it will go up. but it won't be just like a straight $50,000 increase. And I say it will go up if everything else stayed the same, and the only thing that changed was that this staff position was now on the budget for a full year. Does that? Yep.
And I just want to add, too, that the survey will be available for 2 weeks, and then the leadership team will carefully review all of those responses, have a big discussion, prayerful discussion, and then we will be back with our decision for you.
With feedback. Or with releasing the feedback, right? We might not decide in 2 weeks.
No, we won't decide in 2 weeks, but those would be the next steps. So. Any other questions?
Okay, so Bobby's question was to help give context to some of the numbers about what it would cost to fund one of, for instance, this recent opportunity. What was the interest rate that we were given at the time, since interest rates have recently risen, and then the duration of the loan. Yep, and so Rebecca answered and said that the interest rate at the time was around 4%, right, Rebecca? Is that what you said, 4? Okay, around 4%, and then the duration of the loan was 20 to 25 years duration. And a note about this, because this is important too. Let's say that we'd said we're going to make that one happen. That would have required a capital campaign, like a significant capital campaign, where we came to you and we said, okay, we need X amount of dollars. And some of it we need right away, and some of it we need over some sort of period of time in order to, continue to pay this loan, because those 12 months of mortgage payments, they keep coming back every year, they tell me, with interest, and the upkeep of the space, right? Right now, if this roof begins to leak, we don't pay for that. There are pros and cons to both of these. So we're just cluing you in that the budget as it's currently designed has, and this has historically been the case with the Gathering Church, it's always been sort of invested in people, staffing, programming, not in putting money aside or into a building fund, or there's not been those steps that have been taken to sort of save money in order to be able to pay for a mortgage and the maintenance of a building. And so part of what we're doing is we're saying this would require shifts in the way we do church life together to pursue some of this. That's just a true statement. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what we want to do or what we're going to do, but in order to consider that, those are some of the things that would have to happen. Great question, Bobby. Yes, Laura. I don't want to cut Laura off. Laura just nailed, I was going to say stole, that's not true, like nailed the thunder, right? So Laura leads our prayer ministry, in case you didn't know, and wants to, and is inviting and encouraging us as a community to pray for the next week in particular. Not just one of these opportunities or any of these things necessarily specifically, but broadly speaking, to pray for the sort of direction that we're going. How we answer the survey is part of that, for instance. And then she also encouraged us to fast from something during that same week timeline as a way of aligning our wills and our desires with God's will and God's desire, much as Jesus prayed in the Lord's Prayer and in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so it's a wonderful encouragement and a perfect transition because I'm going to close us in prayer, but I'm not leaving yet. So if you have other questions, feel free. I'll just hang down here and we can chat about this for as long, well, maybe not as long as you like, but for a considerable amount of time. So will you join me now in prayer? Gracious and joy-filled God, we give you thanks for the life of our congregation, for the fact that there are children growing in women's bodies in our congregation right now, that life is happening in the midst of this church, that we're an intergenerational congregation, that we come from lots of places and backgrounds. Lord, we're grateful that you have drawn us together, that you're knitting us together as your people. Lord, we want to approach you with boldness, to ask for wisdom and discernment, to ask for your guidance. Lord, we need you to direct us, to chart this path forward and to walk alongside us, to go before and behind and around. God, we do our best to relinquish control, to loosen our grips. God, may we approach you with open hands. And Lord, may we be bold, not just in our prayers to you, but in the ways we live and move as a congregation in this community. That we might boldly seek the healing and the restoration that you provide, not just for us, but for this whole world.